This is the largest structure in Petra. The rock here looks as if it were cut out with a cookie cutter. Ruins of a wall that completely defy human proportions. I wouldn't be surprised if some of you have never ever heard of Hegra before. Top 10 ancient places that people rarely talk about. The Cube of Zoroaster, Iran. In Iran, there is a mysterious stone structure 12 meters high, built from tightly fitted blocks of white limestone. Its design is suspiciously reminiscent of a lingam. Is it a coincidence or another example of universal sacred geometry principles adopted by different ancient peoples? The name Cube of Zoroaster appeared during the Islamic era, as locals assumed it was a Zoroastrian shrine or the tomb of Zoroaster. In reality, there is no evidence that Zarathustra had anything to do with this building. You can only enter from the outside through a passage reached by steps. To this day, we still don't know what was originally inside. The most striking part here is the roof. It consists of 4 massive slabs, each 7.5 meters long, joined together using dovetail joints, where the wedge-shaped projections of one part fit tightly into the corresponding notches of another, creating a strong, durable connection without the use of nails or mortar. It is one of the few surviving stone structures in the world featuring this type of joinery. Furthermore, although the roof appears flat, it is actually shaped like an extremely shallow pyramid. Excavations and studies of the cube began between 1905 and 1935 under the leadership of German archaeologist and historian Ernst Herzfeld. Before that, the cube was half buried in the ground. It is unclear what these niches were for, but I noticed that the space between them forms the shape of the same Persian cross carved in the cliffs opposite the cube. Right across are 4 huge tombs cut into the cliff. They are attributed to Darius, Xerxes, Artaxerxes and Darius II. Quite a gang gathered there. The structure stands directly opposite the tomb of Darius. To this day, the true function of the so-called Cube of Zoroaster has not been established. One version suggests it was a royal archive or repository for sacred texts. Another claim it was a solar calendar. There is a third version. It could have been a fire temple, as it shares similarities with later Zoroastrian fire temples and has no windows, meeting the requirements for a fire sanctuary protected from wind and impurities. However, archaeologists found no traces of burning or soot inside the cube, so that version remains just a theory. If you approach these cliffs from the other side, you can find a spot with niches like this in the rock. And just 6 kilometers to the south lie the ruins of Persepolis, a complex once phenomenal in its scale. The blocks, columns and doorways here are comparable to those we saw in Baalbek. According to the official version, it was built in 518 BCE and destroyed in 330 by Alexander the Great himself. Looking at these majestic statues, one can imagine just how monumental the complex was in its prime. And here is what's interesting. In the cliffs within Persepolis, 2 giant niches are carved out, which are considered unfinished tombs for future burials. The amount of rock removed here is so immense that the combined volume of these 2 niches approaches the volume of rock displaced during the creation of the Kailasa temple in India. Honestly, the sheer scale of construction from that era is just mind-blowing. The Towers of Egil Fortress, Turkey. On a high rocky cliff overlooking the Tigris River in Diyarbakir province lies this megalithic marvel. These are mysterious towers carved directly into the limestone rock. Even official historians estimate them to be at least 5,000 years old. Their exact purpose remains unknown, though it is hypothesized they were either burial chambers or defensive structures. The question remains, Why give a defensive structure a shape that only makes it easier to spot? The surrounding cliffs contain tunnels and rock-cut rooms. Some sources believe this site served a ritual purpose, while others call it an observatory. Basically, the usual range of theories. This site was once the center of the Armenian region of Angehtun, where, according to tradition, the sepulchres of Armenian kings were located. Based on the architectural style and the rock-cutting technique, the structure may have Assyrian or Eurasian roots. It is staggering to think about how all of this was carved under such conditions and at such a height. Unfortunately, information about them is hard to come by, but these towers definitely belong in our collection of megalithic evidence left by ancient builders. They truly look like something straight out of Tolkien's world. Felsenmeer Quarry, Germany. In the Odenwald, in southwestern Germany, lies a unique natural formation that resembles a river of rocks, a massive scatter of giant diorite boulders. Among these stones, a fascinating monolithic column 10 meters long was discovered, along with fragments of other columns and this massive structural detail. The mystical German forest, combined with giant stones from antiquity, creates a truly fantastic atmosphere. In fact, the Odenwald region is shrouded in countless legends and traces of pre-Christian cultures. It was a place of power during pagan times, and in the Middle Ages it was known as a site for witches' sabbaths. Returning to the stones, the prevailing scientific theory is as follows. The quarrying and processing were carried out by the Romans around the 3rd century BC. This is supported by numerous traces of manual labor found at the site. However, there is one detail to keep in mind. Diorite is one of the hardest and most difficult stones to work with that has ever been used in ancient construction. The ancient Egyptians were the absolute masters of working with it, using it for statues of pharaohs, sarcophagi and slabs. The Romans, on the other hand, only turned to diorite in exceptional cases for the most expensive projects. Their standard practice was to use materials that were much easier to process, such as travertine, limestone and marble. In short, I'm looking at this place with a fair amount of suspicion and believe it requires further study. But now let's move on. The megalithic jars of Pokekea. Fascinating remains of a unique ancient culture can be found on the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia. It is certainly not Easter Island, but the artifacts are impressive nonetheless. Over 400 massive megaliths in the shape of jars, resembling giant cocoa bowls, are scattered across the island. Known as kalamba, they are carved from local basalt, with the largest reaching height up to 2 meters. In fact, this right here is the world's largest ancient stone jar, 2.5 meters in diameter, nearly 2 meters high and weighing approximately 6 tons. 7 of such mysterious faces are carved on its outer sides. These giant urns, their lids and other enigmatic fragments are scattered throughout the area. The jars looks as though they were created using the same method used to make a pottery on a pottery wheel. Except, instead of small clay vessels, we are looking at 2-meter-tall stone bowls. You begin to wonder if the ancients here possessed stone softening technology or created this out of geopolymer concrete. Supporting this theory are numerous mysterious marks, indentations that look like they were made in soft clay or Play-Doh. Interestingly, according to a 2010 study by the Makassar Archaeological Center in Indonesia, these stone jars were carved from solid blocks of volcanic rock, likely basalt or andesite. Moreover, it is claimed that only the simplest stone and metal tools were used. Let me remind you that these rocks are far from easy to work with, and there are roughly 400 of these vats here. There are also statues. On one of the lids, you can see that these mysterious faces don't look quite human. These beings resemble animals, perhaps monkeys. It makes you wonder, did creators of these vats look like this, Or was there a cult dedicated to worshipping other living beings? Cava di Cusa, Sicily. On the island of Sicily, tucked away amidst olive groves, lies one of the most unique frozen sites of antiquity. Cava di Cusa is an abandoned ancient quarry where excavation began in the 6th century BC. The entire quarry functions like a massive assembly line for carving columns. Approximately 60 limestone blocks are scattered here, many of them cylindrical and found in various stages of completion. From above, the rock looks as if it were cut out with a cookie cutter. It is a staggering sight. The diameter and length of these column sections reach up to 2.5 meters. Once assembled, a single full column could weigh between 20 to 30 tons. The extracted stone was allegedly used for the construction of temples in the ancient Greek city of Selinunte. Because the stones here were left at different stages of production, it is clear that the quarry was abandoned very suddenly. The most popular theory I've encountered in the comments is the idea of giant hollow drills used by ancient builders to cut these massive columns. But what does official history say? It claims that stonemasons first carved the top of the column in a circle and then gradually worked their way down until the cylinder was almost entirely separated from the bedrock. In 409 BC, work at the quarry was abruptly halted due to the approach of the Carthaginian general Hannibal Mago. His arrival led to a war in which Selinunte was ultimately defeated and destroyed. After that, the quarry was never used again. Slaves and laborers fled to escape the invasion. The stone blocks they were working on were left exactly where they stood and have remained there to this day. In this particular case, I'm actually inclined to believe the official version. After all, by working from the top down, carving these shapes shouldn't have been an impossible task. Though transporting them and assembling them into full-scale giant columns was still a feat in itself. The only thing I want to point out are these mysterious long marks. If you know what kind of tool ordinary people could have used to leave them, please let me know in the comments. And we're moving on. The rock necropolis of Hegra. In the middle of the Saudi Arabian desert lies the ancient city of the dead Al-Hijr, more commonly known in the West as Hegra. Here, 111 mysterious structures of various sizes have been found, carved directly into the rock face. Officials refer to them as tombs of the ancient Arab Nabatean people who inhabited the area from the 3rd century BC to the 2nd century AD. In 106 AD, the Nabatean kingdom was annexed into Roman Empire, after which Hegra gradually fell into decline. The complex consists of 6 clusters. Each cluster is made up of one or more sandstone outcrops into which these tombs were carved. Nabatean inscriptions have been found on many of the tombs, specifying the name of the deceased, dates and curses directed at anyone who would disturb their peace. In Islamic tradition, Hegra is associated with the people of Thamud, who according to the Quran were destroyed for their sins. For a long time, locals avoided this place, considering it cursed. Until the 2000s, the territory was closed to tourists as it was regarded as a place where Allah's wrath fell. The most famous of the 111 tombs in Hegra is the tomb of Lihyan, son of Cusa. It is called the Lonely Castle because it stands apart from the other tombs on a separate outcrop. Though it would be more accurate to say the outcrop itself was shaped into the structure. At one time, a photo of this site was my desktop wallpaper for a long while. This is the largest tomb in Hegra, with a facade height of 22 meters. The interior chamber, much like the other tombs, isn't particularly spectacular. It's a fairly modest space with no unusual markings. Now, let me share some of the most unusual finds in this region. In the Jabal al-Banat cluster, we see series of unfinished structures. This is the most interesting one. There is no doubt that the carving was done from the top down. There is even a tiny incomplete cave like this. In this spot you can see how the rock on the sides was somehow leveled out almost along its entire height. Then there is this chamber in the Jabal Ithlib rocks, with its front facade completely destroyed. The dimensions of the chamber are far from modest, you could easily hide a small truck inside. Even though the marks here look like manual labor, I couldn't ignore this ancient heritage, which really isn't talked about enough. I wouldn't be surprised if some of you have never heard of Hegra until now. If that's the case, make sure to subscribe. I have many more interesting and new things to share with you. But there is one detail that haunts me when looking at these rock-cut rooms. That detail is the open doorways. All 111 rooms, which are generally considered tombs, were never closed. There isn't a single trace of door ever existing. No remnants of wood, no signs of stone plugs, hinges or grooves for door installation. Even if we imagine these were all tombs that were looted, why would they be cleaned out so perfectly, and why hasn't a single piece of a door even been found? Even in Japan, plenty of stone plugs for the so-called Kofun tombs were found. It seems like the creators here had never ever heard of doors. Some researchers suggest that the open facade symbolizes a permanent connection between the living and the dead. But I find it hard to believe that people back then were willing to bury their relatives in rooms where any person or animal could enter. Let me know in the comments what you think about this. To be honest, it seems to me that all these rooms could have been something like hotels or temporary shelters, where travelers, weary from the road, could rest and hide from the scorching sun. After all, Hegra, like Petra, was located along ancient trade roads at the crossroads of Arabia, Egypt, Mesopotamia and Syria. All these so-called tombs have wide entrances that offer no protection from looters, but are very convenient for quick entry and ventilation, just like a shelter or a hostel. Furthermore, in none of the 111 chambers was a sarcophagus or a stone coffin found. The niches are empty. There are multi-room tombs with no signs of burials, but instead feature benches along the walls where one could sit or lie down. Some tombs are large as houses, and others are quite tiny. It looks more like lodging options at a motel, deluxe and economy. And 78 kilometers to the northeast lies another inconvenient artifact, the Al-Naslaa Rock. This is a rock formation 6 meters high and 9 meters wide that looks as if it were sliced in half with a laser. Essentially, it is now two massive stones standing on thin pedestals, separated by a perfectly straight gap. There are no traces of crude process in here. To put it bluntly, there are two possibilities. Either this is a very rare example of a perfect crack caused by ground shift, as geologists suggest, or it is a technological cut made by someone a very long time ago. There are petroglyphs of a camel on the rock, dated to the 3rd millennium BCE. The fact that they were left on this specific rock suggests that nomadic tribes found it in this state 5,000 years ago were amazed by its appearance and decided to leave their autographs. Another mystery that has reached us through the millennia. The Cyclopean Walls of Kefalonia, Greece. On the island of Kefalonia, near the ancient city of Crani, lie the remains of a majestic wall that once surrounded the Acropolis with a perimeter of 4.5 kilometers. Imagine a fortified city atop a hill, offering a view of almost the entire island. Strategy? Certainly, but it's also something more. Even today, walls like this raise more questions than answers, as if they were built not just for people and not just by people. Here we have massive raw or roughly processed boulders laid without mortar, yet perfectly fitted together. Part of the wall has been destroyed by earthquakes, and in some places the blocks have shifted, and yet it stands. The walls reach heights of up to 7 meters and thickness of about 4 meters. Some of these stones weigh over 4 tons. Can you imagine how this was built more than 3,000 years ago without modern cranes, transport platforms or computer-generated construction plans? This Cyclopean masonry dates back to the Late Bronze Age, the era of Mycenaean influence on the Ionian Islands, or perhaps even earlier. The Greeks called these walls Cyclopean, believing they were built by the mythical Cyclops. This term later transitioned to archaeologists, who began applying it to megaliths outside of Greece as an expression of technological wonder. Interestingly, similar megalithic ruins are found on neighboring islands as well. Perhaps these are pieces of a single, lost architectural tradition linked not only to Greece but to a broader region, what we call ancient Anatolia. We will talk more about this in one of my upcoming videos, but for now, let's move on. The megalithic fortress of Arwad. On the territory of modern-day Syria lies an island with a very ancient history called Arwad. Here you can find the ruins of wall that simply doesn't align with human proportions. Most interestingly, even official historians claim the wall was built by the Phoenicians about 3,500 years ago, in the 14th century BC. Furthermore, the 20th century British historian Lawrence Irwin Conrad analyzed various sources, including Byzantine and early Islamic chronicles, to reconstruct events related to the conquest of Arwad and description of its fortifications. In his work on the Byzantine and early Islamic Near East, he writes, "During the Byzantine period, the great walls that surrounded the island on all sides except the harbor reached heights of at least 10 meters in some places and were built of massive stone blocks up to 6 meters long and 2 meters high. This means that at one time such a wall encircled most of the island. It is assumed it served as protection against both sea waves and enemy attacks. Today, only fragments of the wall remain, rising right at the water's edge. Also, directly next to the ruins, we see a quarry from which these blocks were extracted on site. You can find interesting marks on the stones that resemble traces of mechanical processing. Divers claim that equally fascinating blocks remain here underwater. If you look closely, satellite imagery clearly shows where the wall once stood. The island of Arwad is mentioned in ancient Egyptian texts as far back as the 14th century BC. It was known by names such as Arwad, Arpada and Arvaditu. In the Bible, it is named as the homeland of the Arvadites, one of the Canaanite peoples. It was a Phoenician city-state with a powerful naval fleet. Later, the army of Alexander the Great was here, and in the Common Era, Arwad became the site of the Crusaders' last stand in the Holy Land. There is also a theory that Arwad was a colony of the lost civilization of Atlantis or their descendants. Taking into account factors such as the unreal gigantism of the blocks and the island's ancient history, there is a high probability that the megalithic walls of Arwad is one of those sites containing traces of an ancient, highly advanced civilization which was later inherited by all those who inhabited the area in subsequent times. The Megawalls of Athens. In the historical center of Athens, just a 10-minute walk from the Acropolis, you can find other giants that captivate with their appearance, mysticism and sheer scale. Standing near the polygonal wall at Pnyx, you are immediately transported into the world of ancient Greek myth about Zeus, the gods of Olympus, Cyclops and Titans. Because believing that this was created by humans is truly difficult. It is believed that the Greeks built the wall in the 4th century BC. Just slightly higher up the hill, you can see the site where these blocks were quarried. There is even a structure resembling a podium. Pnyx is considered one of the world's first places specifically designed for democratic assemblies. Here, Athenian citizens gathered to discuss and make decisions on vital issues of politics, war and peace. One could easily repeat the well-worn phrase about the incredibly precise fitting of the blocks without any mortar despite their massive size. Visually, it somewhat resembles the walls of Sacsayhuamán. The point is that in Athens, this is the only example of such gigantism in polygonal masonry, which raises doubts about whether the period to which official history dates these blocks is correct. Even locals often propose the theory that the Greeks simply repurposed significantly more ancient ruins. That is how strongly the Pnyx wall stands out against the backdrop of other Greek structures, of which there are many here. Number 1. Petra, Jordan. In the southern part of Jordan lies the ancient Nabatean city of Rakhmu, carved into cliffs of brownish-pink sandstone, presumably in the 4th century BC. It is also known as the Rose City. In the Bible, it is referred to as Sela, and when the Greeks and Romans arrived in the 2nd century BC, they named the city with the Greek word Petra, meaning rock. A casual observer might think that Petra is just a single building carved into the cliff, this one for example. But in reality, Petra contains over 1000 burial sites, including tombs, niches and mausoleums. In terms of scale, it is quite comparable to the Ellora cave complex in India. Upon my first cursory look at the site, I noticed that the doorways of the large structures in Petra are clearly not proportionate to human dimensions. And I recall seeing similar tracks like this back in my childhood in the village after a massive grader leveled a dirt road. As of now, only about 15% of the city has been excavated. The actual size could be significantly larger. Out of this 1000, about 40 large structures stand out. Now I will show you the most interesting ones. So, the most famous and impressive building is Al-Naslaa, which in Arabic means the treasury. The name was given by Bedouins, who believed that treasures of ancient kings were hidden in the urn at the top of the facade. This is why there are bullet marks on the urn. The Bedouins would shoot at it, trying to break the magic vessel where gold and artifacts were allegedly kept. This legend gave the tomb its modern name. In reality, however, this urn is made of solid stone and serves as nothing more than decorative ornament. In many photos, it seems like Al-Naslaa isn't anything phenomenal. But that's only until you see a photo with people in it. Suddenly, everything takes a completely different perspective. The scale is truly grand. The height of the so-called treasury is 45 meters, equivalent to a 15-story apartment building. The facade of the treasury is 14 meters taller than the Temple of Bacchus in Baalbek and only 3 meters shorter than the Colosseum. One can only guess the true purpose of this structure. But the main mystery: how did people climb it to such a height with tools and successfully carried out the work? A very sound theory was proposed by Matt Simpson from the channel The Ancient Architects. He dismissed the theory involving scaffolding, as we see no traces of it and wood is a rarity in this region. In his opinion, the key to the puzzle lies in the section of the cliff to the right. Apparently, before the work began, the rock mass looked like this. This is evident because there is much more rock carved away on the right than on the left. The builders climbed this part of the cliff, then moved to the left and began carving from the top down. On the remaining rock to the right, there is even a resemblance of steps, and its height is suspiciously identical to the height of the building to the left. First, the rock at the top was leveled so that one could work on it comfortably, and then the excavation proceeded from top to bottom. Let me know what you think of this theory, and don't forget to subscribe to the Ancient Architects channel. By the way, along the sides you can see specific indentations made very crudely. According to one version, they were made by treasure hunters trying to reach the urn at the top. We will talk about the second version a bit later. Regardless of whether this was manual labor or some high-tech operation, the scale and skill of the builders are impressive. After all, when carving from a cliff, you have no room for error. Everything must be done perfectly the first time, to say nothing of the engineering design. Moving on to the so-called royal tombs, located on the slopes of the Valley of Moses, 600 meters from the treasury. This is the so-called urn tomb. The facade height is 28 meters and the interior chamber height is about 8 meters. I don't know about you, but I could look at this ceiling for hours. What catches the eye are the very interesting tool marks on the ceiling. We will return to them a bit later. In the post-Nabatean period, it was restored by the Romans, and soon after it even became the first local Christian church. But its creators clearly knew more than the Romans did. The current semi-official names here are quite amusing. Urns are depicted at the top of the facades of all large structures, yet one was named the Treasury, another the Urn Tomb, and the third the Monastery. This is how a game of telephone happens, where all ancient buildings become either temples or tombs. To the left of it is the Silk Tomb, named so because of the stripped, shimmering rock that reminded people of silk. The so-called Corinthian tomb looks very similar to Al-Naslaa, but it is much more weathered, which is why it attracts fewer tourists. Its dimensions are only a couple of meters shorter than the Treasury, with an interior chamber nearly 4 meters high. I really love this photo of the Corinthian tomb and the adjacent palace tomb. Notice how tiny the people look against their backdrop. And there are quite a few structures like this here. As we zoom out further, the people become invisible. The palace tomb stands 21 meters tall, but it is the widest of them all at 45 meters. Interestingly, the interior chambers of most of these tombs look quite simple compared to the quality of the finish and the sheer scale of the exterior facades. The palace tomb is a perfect example. We can conclude that the builders in Petra were primarily concerned with creating a beautiful and prominent outward appearance. What things looked like on the inside seemed to interest them less. But that's not all. The Nabateans also had their own theater, and it looked no less impressive. It was likely built later, during the Roman era. This is evident from these strange holes, which are nothing more than parts of tombs that had already been carved out previously. As we can see on the left and right, some of these tombs still remain. By the way, there is a clear example of the difficulties that arise during construction when using the rock carving method. This part of the theater led me to another thought. Would the locals have allowed such a desecration of the tombs? Specifically, would they permit a central place for public performances, rituals, and perhaps even a comedy plays to be built right on top of burial sites? Personally, I think all these smaller structures were nothing more than Nabatean dwellings. Homes carved in the cliffs. It's practical in a hot climate and safe during earthquakes. Otherwise, it would be strange to live in houses where frequent earthquakes constantly kill family members, yet bury the dead in the safest possible locations while spending so much effort on them. Archeologists have confirmed that the small tombs were indeed used as housing, but in a later period. I remind you of the 111 other Nabatean structures located 450 kilometers south of Petra. The purpose of the buildings in both Petra and Hegra was clearly the same, but whether they were actually tombs remains a subject of great doubt. Of all structures in Petra, the treasury is the best preserved, because it is sheltered by neighboring cliffs from the scorching sun and winds. The facade of the royal tombs was much less fortunate. An interesting fact: entry into many buildings is now prohibited because the lower part of the facade was worn away by tourists and guardians constantly leaning against or touching the wall. And for dessert, I've saved a structure that is easily mistaken for the treasury, the so-called Ad-Dair, Arabic for the monastery. It was named a monastery during the Byzantine period. Its true name, given by the Nabateans, has not survived or was never recorded. It is located in the upper part of Petra on a high plateau. To reach it, you must climb about 800 steps carved into the rock. That's why it appears in photos and videos much less frequently. However, it is actually the largest structure in Petra, 48 meters high with a facade 50 meters wide. My first impression of this building was an association with the citadel in Mad Max Fury Road. Perhaps the creators were inspired by it. Just look at this. That's a person standing on the top urn. Climbing up there is now banned, after a Japanese tourist committed suicide and later a young woman from the States accidentally fell to her death while taking a selfie at the top. Do you know what amazes me most about the monastery specifically? Look closely. Consider how much rock had to be removed before they even started carving the facade. It is a rectangular block roughly 48 by 25 meters with a height of 48 meters. That is 56,000 cubic meters of rock, 130,000 tons of sandstone removed before work on the facade even began. That's 6,257 truckloads of stone or 29 million bricks. Yeah, people certainly knew how to work back then. Interestingly, the monastery is considered to have been built later, in the 2nd century AD, because it is larger, simpler in decor, and its style allegedly reflects a later phase of Nabatean architecture with a strong Roman influence. However, local guides usually maintain that the monastery was built in the 4th century BC, and the treasury was a replica of it. Who should we believe? This is where we need to dig deeper. It seems to me that the appearance of the monastery is not a later, cruder Roman style, but rather the original look of the building. The treasury, on the other hand, is a structure that was remodeled into a more ornate Roman style. Those indentations on the side of the treasury were likely made by the Romans to install scaffolding, allowing them to reach the top of the facade and refine the capitals by adding more specific Roman parts. Originally, the treasury likely looked very similar to the monastery. We can even see that the parts of the monastery consist of more bulk material. If desired, it could be trimmed down to the style of the treasury, but the reverse would be impossible. Now let's go back to those mysterious marks on the ceiling of the urn tomb. The fact is, such filigree, perfectly straight lines are impossible to create with a hammer and chisel, especially on the ceiling. They truly resemble the tracks of modern stone-cutting machinery. Granted, our machines aren't designed to cut stone beautifully, but the ancient builders of Petra had exactly that goal. Moreover, if you look closely, you can see the same marks on the columns of the treasury, on its facade, and on the facade of the monastery. Remarkably, on the capitals of the treasury, which were presumably remodeled by the Romans, you can see the marks of actual chisels, small, slanted and uneven. But those machine-like tracks remain a great mystery. Combined with the surreal scale of the excavation, they lead to the suggestion that an ancient civilization worked here, possessing technologies far more advanced than even those of the Romans, who annexed Petra from the Nabateans in 106 AD. I have a 3D printed Moai figure on my desk, and we can see marks here that are somewhat similar to those found in Petra, if you look closely at the details. We can only guess what kind of mechanisms these were. And there is a big question regarding the Nabateans themselves. Could a nomadic people whose typical buildings looked like this create something so grandiose that even Roman masters couldn't compare? Or did they simply take a liking to ancient ruins they discovered and in the following centuries collaborate with the Romans to give them a bit of makeover? Let's not forget that this region was heavily influenced by its connection to Egypt. There was trade, cultural exchange, and even some Egyptian gods migrated to the Nabateans in a modified form. Perhaps the roots should be sought in ancient Egypt. There is even a theory that the Romans first saw the architectural style here in Petra that was later called Hellenistic and became the signature style of the Roman Empire. Official historians allegedly got it all backwards and decided the Romans brought their style here. Everyone can decide for themselves which version of reality to believe, but in the meantime, I never stop admiring these ancient structures and the mysteries they hold. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to subscribe and leave a comment. We are already over 6,000 strong, but I'm sure there will be more. In the next video, we will explore the ancient structures of India. Thank you all so much for watching and see you soon on the Ancient Builders Project channel.